Welcome to the Genomics Revolution, the podcast exploring how we're working at the frontier of science to make the invisible visible to deliver real-world health benefits. I'm Sian Jarvis, and in this episode we'll uncover how genomics is transforming healthcare, moving from reactive to predictive health, from treating disease to preventing it. Today I'm joined by Seamus Harrison, our Chief Medical Officer, who will discuss the NHS HEART Trial and how polygenic risk scores are helping to predict and prevent disease. From the evidence of this trial, we know there is an invisible risk factor for cardiovascular disease that impacts 1 in 5 people, and we've uncovered how we can make this visible to health systems and save lives. But first, Seamus, tell me a bit about yourself and your role here at Genomics.
Yeah, morning, Sian. Yes, I lead our medical team. So I think about how we use our technology and implement it in clinical care and in clinical trials. My background is I was a doctor in the NHS. So I was a vascular surgeon at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge for 7 or 8 years, where I ran an aortic aneurysm screening program. I was also an academic at the University of Cambridge. And I realized that a lot of the operations I was doing in people for their aneurysms or their vascular disease, I was really operating on people with a very end stage of cardiovascular disease. And so by the time I was operating on them, really it was only palliative. And I realized that had these people taken preventative steps much earlier in their lives, they wouldn't have needed the operation with me. So that's what led me to join Genomics about 3 years ago. It seems like a bit of a big jump for a vascular surgeon to join a med tech company, but actually I'd done a PhD in genetic epidemiology and sort of had a side gig in using genetics to predict cardiovascular disease, and most recently was working in the University of Cambridge. So now I really get to operationalize that science. I get to think about our use cases, where we put our polygenic risk scores, and how we can really optimize the clinical benefit of using genetics.
Okay, so I can really understand how you want to focus on kind of prevention. And I mean, I've heard a lot about genomic medicine, but I haven't heard about genomic prevention. So what is that?
Yeah, so genomic medicine typically is when somebody already has a disease, for example, a cancer or a rare disease. We use genetics to try and give them a diagnosis which can inform treatment. But actually, we know that many of the common diseases like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, common cancers such as breast cancer, prostate cancer, they're actually driven by genetic factors. And we know for those diseases that prevention is better than cure. So as I mentioned, I was operating on people with very end stage disease. Had those people taken preventative measures in the 30s and 40s, they may not have needed the operation. The trick, though, is understanding which individuals are at risk of which disease. And that's very hard. Predicting common diseases is something that the field has been involved in for 20 or 30 years, but it's really hard. What we've learned in the last 15 to 20 years is that we can use genetics to predict an individual's risk of developing those diseases. But unlike in genomic medicine, where the diseases are typically determined by a single genetic mutation, many of the common diseases are driven by genetic variations across hundreds of thousands of positions across our genome.
Wow.
And we can now take literally hundreds of thousands of variants and calculate a single number which represents an individual's risk of developing a specific disease.
So, I mean, roughly how many people are at genetic risk of developing CVD?
It's a great question. So if the way we measure polygenic risk score tends to be on a spectrum. So if you take the top 20% of that spectrum, those individuals are about 50% increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease in their lifetime. Another way to look at it may be that about 1 in 13 individuals has a very high risk of developing cardiovascular disease, at risk similar to individuals with a disease called familial hypercholesterolemia, which is a monogenic disease that we look for in genomic medicine. So a really interesting thing to consider is that across many different diseases, almost everybody in the population will be at risk of at least one of the diseases because they're all common.
We already have risk predictors and treatments for cardiovascular disease. So I guess my question is, how does genetics really change that paradigm?
Yeah, great question. So the first thing to say is you're right. We do have doctors look for a range of cardiovascular risk factors to identify people who are at the highest risk of developing disease. So, for example, people in their midlife will go and get health checks with their GP, and things like your cholesterol, your weight, your blood pressure will all be checked. And that information will all be combined into a single algorithm, which gives you your risk over the next 10 years. One of the problems with this approach is that the strongest risk factors in the algorithms that we use are your age and your gender. And that's because cardiovascular disease is much more common in older men. And so that tends to drive the majority of the calculation. We know that genetic risk alone in younger individuals can account for as much risk as all those other risk factors combined. So if you take men between 40 and 50, ask what is the contribution of genetic risk factors versus what is the contribution of clinical risk factors, we find the genetic risk factors actually adds more than the clinical risk factors alone. The other thing to say is that your genetics are set at birth, so you can measure it very early. So you can identify an individual in the 30s or 40s who has a very high lifetime risk of developing cardiovascular disease because their genetics are set. Things like blood pressure, weight, LDL cholesterol, they seem to vary throughout life, whereas your polygenic risk score, a bit like your age, is set and immutable. So you can identify those individuals really early in life and start instituting the right preventative measures.
But because it's fixed, because your PRS, your genetics are fixed, doesn't that limit the potential of genetics and using PRS to support the treatment and prevention of CVD?
Yeah, that's a great point. So many people will point to that and say, well, the risk factors we look for tend to be modifiable. So that means that if your weight's too high, you can engage in lifestyle measures in order to reduce your weight, or you can take medicines to reduce your cholesterol. And so there's some really important evidence that has emerged over the past, say, 5 to 10 years. And that's that individuals with high genetic risk for coronary artery disease, they actually derive more benefit from treatments for coronary artery disease risk than people who don't have high genetic risk. So from large trials of statins to prevent cardiovascular disease, we see that the effectiveness is greatest in those with high genetic risk. We've now seen that in trials for PCSK9 inhibitors and also trials of antiplatelet medicines. So there's a really strong body of evidence that the treatments we use for modifiable risk factors are actually more beneficial in people who have high genetic risk. And so although you can't change your PRS, you can reduce your risk considerably by taking these safe and effective measures.
Gosh, so with that evidence then, I guess the screaming question is, why aren't PRS used more widely?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it's new. And so typically new things that are complicated, medicine's conservative. It has to be. It needs to be. Safety of the patient has to be a top priority. And so the ability to operationalize these genetic scores is something that we've really only been able to do over the past couple of years. The second point to say is that in addition to the conservatism, you need to be able to demonstrate that this complex new technology can actually improve on the paradigm, but can also fit into established workflows. Because if you have a new technology and it doesn't sit in the sort of standard prevention paradigm, then arguably the additional effort used to introduce that technology will detract from what has already been done. So with that in mind, that's why we've spent a lot of time validating our technology and evaluating our technology in specific clinical settings.
I was going to say, I was going to talk about that, and we can come back to the HEART trial. But I guess one of the questions that I'm asked a lot, when I'm dealing with policymakers, politicians, officials, is, they're inundated with innovation, new technologies. How do they begin to sort the wheat from the chaff? I guess the evidence is critical.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a whole world of new AI algorithms, use of genetics, use of different personalized medicine devices, and it's really hard to determine which are the right ones, which ones are actually performing as they should. And that's why we've been pretty slow and conservative in how we've thought about introducing this, particularly in the NHS, where we know that things are necessarily cash constrained. So we've spent time validating our technique, our polygenic risk scores, but not only have we validated our scores, we've validated combining our scores with standard of care. So combining polygenic risk scores with clinical risk algorithms that are used to predict cardiovascular disease. So we validated that and we've published that in well-respected peer-reviewed journals. We've then considered, now that the score is validated, how many events could we actually prevent if our scores were routinely used in clinical practice. And so we were able to partner with the University of Leicester and look at data from individuals who were having these NHS health checks in midlife. We found that, again, in younger individuals between 40 and 55, if we added genetics to the clinical scores that are routinely used in those clinics, we could increase the number of people identification of the number of people who would have gone on to have a heart attack by about 50%. So that's an enormous increase.
Huge.
So if you think the bang for your buck for your NHS health check, if you can improve that by 50% by identifying those people who should be on statins early in life, that's really an enormous delta or improvement.
And what did what did the patients, what did the doctors themselves actually think about using these PRS? I mean, when they see results like that, I mean, it's pretty staggering.
So that study in the University of Leicester was done retrospectively, but what we recognized is that we had to have really strong evidence of implementing this prospectively, and that's the HEART study. So the HEART study was different. The HEART study was not about how effective is the polygenic risk score. It was about taking this new technology and putting it into standard work streams and saying, how do doctors like it? How do patients like it? Does it improve the flow? Does it detract from the flow of standard care pathways? So we did a large trial in the north of England. We worked with 13 different GP practices, somewhere in the region of 800 different patients, each coming in for their, again, midlife NHS health check. And in this case, we offered individuals access to genetic testing. So we combined the genetic test with a score called QRISK-2, which is the score that takes your cholesterol, your postcode, your blood pressure, and so on.
Yeah. So this is the health check that happens at 40 on the NHS.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So the NHS recommends that individuals from the age of 40 have routine checks where their cholesterol's checked, their blood pressure's checked, to identify which individuals should be taking treatment to reduce the risk of heart disease. So this study was about, really, could we put genetics into that without detracting from workflows, without overwhelming doctors with complicated new information, without overwhelming or worrying patients unnecessarily by using their genetics. Overwhelmingly, we found that introducing genetics to that pathway was beneficial. So we asked patients what they thought about it, so patients who underwent it. And 99% of them found that the information provided by their genetics was clinically useful for them.
Right.
We also asked doctors, did you find this useful? Was this too complicated? Does this fit with your standard workflows? And overwhelmingly, the answer was yes.
I guess because it fitted beautifully into something that's already operationalized.
Exactly. So we were building on what already happens.
Yes.
We weren't doing additional consultations. We weren't doing additional blood tests. It was all within the pathway. And the other thing that we heard from doctors was that rather than kind of have a black box where a number comes out, we returned a report which gave the individuals a clinical score, QRISK-2, and also gave a score where the QRISK was combined with their genetics. Right. So you might imagine if your QRISK score, if your risk of developing heart disease in the next 10 years is 5%, but you have bad genetics, that risk might go to 10%. Whereas if you have very good genetics, it might go down to 2 or 3%. Okay. And so when the information was presented in that way, GPs found it very easy to contextualize with the patient what their genetics meant in context of the other modifiable risk factors that we already look for. We also found and heard from GPs that sometimes when individuals are around the sort of stage where they should consider taking statins or other preventative measures, sometimes that can be a difficult conversation because people feel that the clinical risk calculators are very generic. It's not for me. I'll be able to go off and reduce my risk by doing other things. But when we add genetics to it, the GPs told us that the conversation was much more personalized, much more directed. And there were people who, over a period of time, had said they don't really want to take statins, but when they learned they had both bad clinical risk and bad genetics, it was a whole different conversation. And they were much more on board with engaging with preventative treatments.
Well, isn't that fascinating? Because I guess one of the, when it comes to healthcare and good healthcare, obviously the medications are really critical, the diagnostics and all the rest of it, but actually engaging people in their health and then getting people to change their behavior, helping to sort of empower them in order to do that, I guess, is where we really would like to get to. So where would you like this work to go next?
Well, I think that the evidence that we can engage individuals with their cardiovascular risk and identify which individuals should be focused upon for preventative measures. I'd really like to see that scaled up and rolled out, so individuals throughout the NHS can have access to this personalised information. Uh, Undoubtedly, by getting those individuals on statins or in the right preventative programs earlier, we'll be able to prevent a number of cardiovascular events and ultimately prevent our A&Es from filling up with people who have having heart attacks and strokes. But it's not just cardiovascular disease. So when an individual age 40 or in the 40s attends their GP for a health check, it's an opportunity to engage that individual with their health and to identify risks for a broad range of diseases, not just cardiovascular disease. So, for example,
Hmm.
we could identify individuals at very high risk of type 2 diabetes who should be in the diabetes prevention programs or should have intensive lifestyle measures offered. We can identify individuals who have very high risk of developing breast cancer. So in the UK, breast cancer screening starts at 50. We know that about 18% of cases of breast cancer occur in women before the age of 50. So if we can identify those women who are at high risk of developing breast cancer, then they can engage in mammographic screening earlier in their life and support early detection.
In your case, you just mentioned diabetes, but I mean, people's in terms of developing, they have kind of indications of pre-diabetes. You can do a HbA1c test that already gives you a much kind of earlier signal that diabetes is on the way. So, do you really need the genetic risk factor?
Well, again, type type 2 diabetes risk detection, we use clinical algorithms. And the clinical algorithms sometimes include HbA1c, but often they don't. Sometimes they are based on clinical risk factors such as your BMI or your ethnicity. But we know through our evaluation of very large biobanks that genetic risk can be as important as BMI, for example, in some individuals. And if you have a normal BMI, but a high genetic risk, the chances are you'll go and see your doctor, and your doctor won't even think about your diabetes risk because you're not overweight. And
Mm.
so being able to identify those individuals, I think, could be really helpful.
Okay, so you started to mention sort of other diseases. I can see it would be useful in breast screening. What other conditions can you begin to spot early?
Well, the first thing to say is that almost all of the common diseases that we deal with
Mm.
are genetic in some component. So all of the common cancers, so prostate cancer is another good example. Prostate cancer in the UK, we don't have a standardized screening program. And the advice is that men should have an individualized discussion with their GP about whether or not they should engage in prostate cancer screening. But of course, it's quite difficult to have an individualized conversation if you don't have a family member who's had prostate cancer. Whereas if we can easily use the genetics to say, Seamus, your risk of developing prostate cancer in your lifetime is 20 or 30%. And that would be a very different decision for me than if my lifetime risk was 5%, for example. I would be much more likely to engage in regular prostate cancer screening. But not only are there the diseases that we're currently screening for, if we look into the future of healthcare, there's a bunch of new diseases that we don't currently screen for, but are incredibly important. One really good example is obesity. So there are a whole range of new treatments for obesity, and we know that obesity affects millions and millions of people
Mm.
worldwide. And people who are obese have risk of developing type 2 diabetes, developing heart disease, developing kidney failure. And so identifying individuals who are most likely to become obese and suffer complications of obesity would provide a window for us to institute lifestyle measures and or medications if necessary.
And would that help us to also target perhaps who should have the weight loss medication programs or be enrolled onto those programs?
I think it would certainly give an indication of who is most likely to progress to obesity.
Mm.
But there's also pretty good evidence that understanding obesity genetics understands how hard an individual has to try to prevent themselves from becoming
Mm.
obese. So there's a really interesting study from the US which evaluated again adults in midlife and asked how many steps do these individuals have to take to prevent themselves from becoming obese in the future. And the difference between somebody with bad genetics and somebody with good genetics was enormous. It was something like 10,000 steps difference. So to think of a world in which we give just standard
Yes.
one-size-fits-all advice to people
Yeah.
without using their genetics just seems crazy when it can be, very easily captured and communicated to individuals.
Gosh, so we've heard so much about personalized medicine, but here we're talking about personalized prevention programs.
Exactly. So, if you tell me I need to take 10,000 steps a day
Mm.
to prevent myself becoming obese, but I have very bad genetics, the likelihood is I'll try and do the 10,000 steps and find that I'm still gaining weight
Mm.
and become very frustrated. But if I understood that actually with my genetics, maybe I need to walk 15,000 steps a day, then it's a whole different conversation. And again, we talked about it earlier, it's about engaging individuals, about understanding their own risk early in life so they can take relatively small measures early in their life to prevent them from needing to take much larger measures later in their life.
And is there any way in which we can use our better understanding of genetics to predict which treatments would be better suited to an individual as well?
So that's the paradigm largely in rare diseases and cancers. In common diseases such as obesity and cardiovascular disease, we've not quite got to that stage yet where the genetics can inform you exactly which treatment would be best for you. That's where we'd love to get to, undoubtedly. And for diseases like obesity, type 2 diabetes, to a certain degree, coronary heart disease, they're very heterogeneous. So you may have one individual whose heart disease is driven by smoking, and other individuals whose heart disease is driven by high cholesterol. And we'd love to get to a point where we could say the best treatment for you is this and the best treatment for you is that, but we're not quite there yet.
So we call the podcast the Genomics Revolution. It sounds like it's part revolution, part evolution.
I think so. I think that to say that we can fix everything with genetics is probably a step too far, but recognizing that we've built really powerful prevention programs for a range of diseases, but we can improve these further with the addition of this new technology, I think that's probably the way that I see it.
Seamus, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please follow us or subscribe, and you can find our contact details in the description below.